In this video, we are going to discuss R Markdown and how we can use it to generate reproducible reports for data science. If you watched the introduction to R Markdown, you'll recall that we discussed how R Markdown documents can contain text interwoven with code chunks. R Markdown also has a third type of content, and this is called a YAML header. YAML, Y-A-M-L, stands for Yet Another Markup Language. The YAML header can be quite important and useful when we are starting to think about using our R Markdown documents in order to generate reports. Let me show you how an R Markdown document works. When we want to create a report, we can do something that is called knit an R Markdown document. To knit the document, there's a knit button within RStudio, and we click that, and it converts our R Markdown document into, in this case, an HTML document. And this is going to then have some text, some code, and also the results of the code that then are formatted into a beautiful report. The way that knit works is it's going to take the R Markdown document and convert it into a regular flavored Markdown document. And then this can be converted into multiple different document types. If you want to make a PDF of your report, then you can knit from an RMD into a PDF. If you also then want to make that into a PowerPoint presentation to share with somebody, or a Word document in order to incorporate it into some other Word document, you can do all of these from the exact same R Markdown document. See, this is where the power of these R Markdown documents come, is we can then convert our code and our outputs into multiple different file types, all starting with the same code. The engine that is driving the conversion of an R Markdown document into all of these different output file types is a package that's called R Markdown. Now, R Markdown has way too many different special formatting types and options and outputs and so on that we can discuss here today. But fortunately, there is a definitive guide to R Markdown that is free and available online. So if you can imagine, I wish my R Markdown document could do this thing, it's probably possible. Because R Markdown documents are converted to Markdown before being converted into these other file types, that means that we can take advantage of the very simple formatting rules of a Markdown document and apply them to be included in our output report. If you're not familiar with Markdown, Markdown is a programming language that is going to very simply change text into other types of formatted text. So we can take our plain text and convert it into a numbered list or into bold or into a header quite simply. And so let me show you a couple of examples here. First, we can automatically generate headers by putting the number sign with a space before we type our next word. So we have 6 different levels of headers. So if we want a level 1 header, the largest, we can use 1 number sign and a space and then our word. And if we want the smallest header, a 6th level header, then we have 6 number signs and so on. This can be oftentimes useful when we're creating our Markdown documents. And let's say we have a report with several different types of steps. We could then put a header for each of these steps to indicate this is going to be my import step, this is going to be my data wrangling step, and this is going to be my exploratory data analysis step, and so on. This then might help you go back and find these headers more quickly and more easily. We can then also format plain text. If we want to take text and we want to then, let's say, italicize it, we can put a single line in front of that word that we want italicized and another one after it. If we want bold, we have 2 asterisks before the word, and when we want the bold to end, 2 asterisks after, and so on. So there are several different types of plain text formatting that we can simply do with this Markdown language. One of the important things to mention here is if we want to then add a new line at the end of text, we don't hit return. What we want to do is we want to make sure there are 2 spaces at the end of a line. This is then the language, this is the code that Markdown uses to say, this is where a new line needs to be. We can then also do things like make simple lists. A bulleted list is going to be an asterisk with a space. A numbered list is going to be a number with a period and then a space. And remember, if we need a new line, don't forget to put those 2 spaces at the end. We can then also add hyperlinks. So oftentimes, when I'm making some reports, I will want to say where I got a package from, where I got a data set from, where I got an idea for an analysis from, and oftentimes have that link. Well, we can paste that link, but if that link is a long, messy URL, that then might be something that we don't want in our report. But if we want to just have the link, we can then have a square bracket around the link, and then a parentheses around the URL where we want that to go. This hyperlink will then look like this image here on the right, where we have a link with the link being the hyperlink. We can also add images. Images can be a URL or it can be a file path. We can have an exclamation point, our bracket, and then a parentheses, a path to an image. For example, the RStudio logo here. I'll also mention that we can write equations using LaTeX math commands surrounding them by $signs. For example, if we want E equals MC squared, we can surround that in the $signs and then have the formatting, the math LaTeX formatting, in order to have this output within our report. This is just a flavor of what R Markdown can do. Fortunately, the R Markdown cheat sheet has the most common R Markdown formatting things you might want to include in your report. I'll also mention that RStudio has in their help menu a Markdown quick reference. This can also be a useful guide. If you just can't remember how to make something italics, you can then go here and get that quick reminder. So these are just some of the types of formatting that you can do to text in order to change how it's output in the final report. So text is one element of our R Markdown document, but code is another one. If we dive in a little bit deeper now, our code chunk is going to be separated by these 3 backticks on one end and 3 backticks on the other end. This is how RStudio knows that this is a code chunk. What we can then do is we can insert a chunk of R code that then is going to run when we knit our document. Remember, when we knit our document, it's going to knit as if everything was fresh. It's not going to remember anything that you've made before. So when we knit our document, we need to have every step of our analytic process there. Otherwise, our knit will break and it will give you an error message because something is missing. Remember, these code chunks are going to be a special command that R Markdown recognizes so that when you render this report, when you knit your R Markdown document, the actual code chunk commands, these backticks on the front end and the backticks on the back end, those won't be included in your report. So don't worry about those. This is just the special function that tells R Markdown to consider this an R code chunk. One of the things I'd encourage you to do is to get familiar with the shortcut for inserting a code chunk. Now, if you're on a Mac or on a PC, these are slightly different, but what you want to do is you will be inserting many of these code chunks. So go ahead and overcome that early struggle of this awkward shortcut, and before you know it, your fingers will just be including these as you're going through your R Markdown document. Now, your code chunks have some different options. By default, R Markdown includes both the results and the code when you knit the document. So if you have a code chunk, and that code chunk has a small piece of code, and you knit that document, you will see both the code and the result. Sometimes you might not want the code. You would only want the output. In this case, you can add a parameter to your code chunk right at the beginning within the curly bracket that says echo equals false. If you do this, then when you knit your report, you will not see the code, you will only see the output. This can be really useful for plots. When you start getting into making some complex plots, the code for these plots can be like up to a page long. So you might want to collapse that, hide that code, and only have the output of that plot within your report. Let's say that you're generating this report that needs to then be viewed by somebody who's not technical. They might want to just see the plot, but not really the code that is underlying it. In this case, echo equals false might help you do that. Sometimes you would also want to include some code, but maybe not have it run. The way to do that within R Markdown is to add a different argument to your code chunk, and this is called evaluate. If you set eval equal to false, then what you will have is just the code, but not the output. So the code will be there, but it doesn't run the code, so there's no output. Sometimes you wouldn't want to include either. If you have, let's say, a setup chunk, and your setup chunk has a lot of libraries that you attached and several other parameters that aren't so important for a report, you can set include to equal false. This is important because you will run the code, which is important, especially if it's a setup chunk. So you'll run the code, but it will not have the code and it will not have the output. So again, this is going to be useful for the setup and maybe in some other cases, but I just want to alert you that this is a possibility. Oftentimes, we can also specify other parameters. Let's say how we want the code chunk to behave. So if we have an image, and that image is going to be a plot that we made in our code chunk, we could set the output of that plot within the parameters of the plot function itself, or we can set some constraints for how large that image is in the context of our whole R Markdown document, our whole report, by setting the figure width or figure height, again, within the parameters of this code chunk. So in this case, it will take these arguments, figure width and figure height, and add them to our plot and constrain how large that plot is going to be. One other useful tip is that we can also include some R code in our text chunk. So hold on a second. I just told you that R Markdown documents have some text and they also have code chunks. Well, if sometimes we want to evaluate just a small snippet of code within our text, we don't need to add a whole code chunk. What we can do is we can have a single backtick. We can put a small lowercase r and then a little bit of code and another backtick. This will then allow R to run that small piece of code. So a great example is if we want to include the date. The date can be automatically fetched from the function sys.date. If we want to include that in our report, we could put sys.date in a code chunk, and then we'd have to set whether we want the code to be there or just the output and so on. Or the other option is to have a single backtick, r space the function sys.date parentheses, and then another backtick, and you can see the output will be today is and then today's date.